What is the creepiest and most unexplained paranormal experience you've ever had? That's the name of the topic for today's video, presented by Midnight Monster. I've handpicked 10 very specific stories that are pretty creepy. If you've ever experienced anything unexplained or paranormal, do share your story in the comment section below, and let's hop into today's story number 1. My stepmom and dad used to work opposite shifts there for a while. He was on nights, her on days. They had a set of baby monitors from when my sister and I were babies. My dad said they could record short messages with him, and they would leave them out on the coffee table for others to hear when they get home from their shift. This went on for a bit, then once their shift lined up, they put the monitors away in storage. Well, she died of cancer at a young age, and my dad had just gotten back from the funeral and was home alone. He spent the night going through their things, packing some of her stuff away. He said he only had the baby monitor sitting out on the coffee table, and it woke him up in the middle of the night with an old message going off on repeat that she had recorded. It said, "I love you, Mike. I love you, Mike." Over and over and over. My dad told me he just sat on the couch in the dark and listened to her messages until the batteries died. A couple weeks later, he had picked us kids up for the weekend. After my sister and I went inside, he said he was sitting on the porch smoking, and a strong gust of wind blew, and he said he could smell the perfume that she always wore. It scared me to hear those stories as a kid, but now I can see the beauty and peace in those experiences. This just reminded me of a small occurrence that I had when I was a teenager. I was home alone for the weekend, and my parents had memory foam mattresses on their bed, so I guess you could say it was infinitely more comfortable than mine. I decided to sleep in their bedroom and enjoy the comfy bed on night 1, even though I knew they hated when one of us kids would do that. I settled down to sleep and felt immediately unsettled. I have anxiety, so I just told myself I was feeling off because of my new surroundings, that I was super comfy and once I fell asleep I'd be fine. I turned on the TV and watched some old cartoons. Once I was ready to sleep, I turned the TV off and put the remote on the nightstand by my head. I rolled over and did my best to fight the unsettled feeling I had. I woke up to the light from the TV shining on my face and cartoons playing once again. I was confused, but whatever. I probably just fell asleep and never actually turned the TV off. I glanced at my phone and it was only about 45 minutes after I, quote, went to bed. So I just turned off the TV again and set the remote back on the dresser. I fell back asleep pretty easily because I was groggy already. I was half asleep, woken up a bit by a loud conversation. As I woke up more and more, I became disturbingly aware that the TV was back on. I rolled over to face it and was playing this scene where a bunch of people was sitting around a table talking about something. One of the first things I realized after I woke up was the TV's volume was incredibly loud, and I had set it pretty quiet before going to sleep. I watched for a minute, confused about how the TV got back on and what was playing, since it was not the same channel I left on before I went to bed. I reached for the remote and my hand touched the solid wood of the dresser. Telltale horror movie music starts playing softly in the background, or the scenes as it pans around the room, and I'm fully awake, feeling around the floor for the remote control that I must have knocked off the stand in my sleep. I'm starting to shit bricks due to the now insanely loud suspenseful music and the TV turning on by itself on a different channel. I decide I have to turn on the light, so I jump out of bed, take about 5 steps towards the door when I see the remote on the floor, pointing in a straight line from where I was standing to where the light switch was. I make a weird sound between a yelp and a cry. Yeah. Flick the lights on and grab the remote, turning down the volume to a reasonable level. It was completely maxed. I checked to see what show was playing, and it was some older horror movie playing on a movie channel. I bug out of the room as fast as I can and just leave the TV on, and superstition. Who am I to judge if someone else is trying to enjoy the empty house with me? It took me long time to fall asleep in my bed that night. I asked my parents if they've ever had problems with the TV turning on randomly at all, and they looked at me like I was super dense. After that, I never tried to sleep in that room again. I lived in a haunted apartment. It has 2 rooms, but one of the rooms was locked and I did not have the key. I only had one small room like the kitchen, dining room, and bedroom, and a screened-in porch. There were 2 especially freaky events. One night, my girlfriend slept over and she woke up in the middle of the night and said she saw the bathroom door open and a shadowy figure standing in the bathroom staring at her. The bathroom was right across from the locked room. Another time, I was jerked awake by the fire alarm going off, just blaring, but when I went to unplug it, the alarm just stopped. No alarm in the building was going off. A lot of things that happened could have been just my neighbors, but the way they happened, well, was weird. I would hear knocking, and it sounded like someone just tapping a spoon on the counter. Coming from the downstairs apartment, it could have been my neighbor, but I'm not sure why she would do that every couple of minutes for hours on end, or in the middle of the night. I would also hear knocking on the walls. It sounded like someone tapping their way up the wall like they were looking for a stud. I would also hear this weird moaning or howling that I could not trace the source of. Again, could have been my neighbor's dog, but it did not sound like it was coming from her apartment. The apartment across from me had 3 tenants in a year. I think because it was just as more haunted than mine. I had, I think, what was a unique way of coping. I named the ghost Pete. After a previous tenant's mail I would get from time to time and try talking to him, basically treating him like a roommate I was friends with. My girlfriend was much more freaked out by the situation than I and stopped coming over after a few months, so I wasn't there much anyways. When I was, I felt that talking to Pete made the atmosphere of the whole place much more friendly. I also left out a sheet of paper with Pete's notes written on it and told him if he had any problems, just write them down. I still don't know if I quite believe in ghosts, though I find the supernatural fascinating. That experience did push me closer to the quote, "Science doesn't know everything." This happened when I was 17. When I was still living at my childhood home, I was sneaking out late at night to meet some friends. I went through the back door of the house, and as I turned to face the door, I could just feel somebody watching me. I thought I was busted. I turned to look at who had caught me and saw a monochrome figure. The hair was completely black, blacker than black. Her face was like a static washed over white and gray, and she was wearing a dress that was in between 2 colors. No facial features, just the silhouette of a young girl facing me. I reached for the door as fast as I could, and when I went to shut it, it closed very quickly on me. I bolted through my yard and onto the street and could not shake the feeling. I was being followed. I stayed with my friends that night. Soon after this happened, I was up late with my mom watching a movie, and my dad had just passed away. We finish our movie up and say goodnight and turn on the TV. Stereo receiver and DVD player all with their remotes. After a short amount of time in bed, I'm jarred awake by the sound of static with the speakers cranked up on the TV with no input. My mom and I meet in the hallway, surprised to see that we've both been awoken to an empty house. A few years ago, when I was 23-ish and graduating from college, I finally told my family about the first occurrence. Before I can finish my description of the ghost, she finishes for me, telling me that she and her friend used to see a little girl in our backyard playing in a sundress. She said she looked maybe 12. Our neighbor, who was the original owner, shared a story with us about the family that originally bought the house after it was built. It was a younger family whose daughter passed away from leukemia. She would have been the same age. Looking back, the girl wasn't scary or harmful. My sister had the same impression. To this day, I believe we saw and haven't seen anything like it ever since. My grandfather was a bad man, alcoholic, extremely violent, and tried to kill my grandmother in front of their kids. One of his less horrible acts was abandoning my grandmother with their 6 kids, all under the age of 12. Some of his kids maintained minimal contact with him. He lived about 30 or 40 miles from my grandmother and the 2 kids who'd stayed in the area. When he was in his 80s, he was hospitalized and then passed away in the middle of the night. In the morning, his oldest child, which was one of my aunts, went to the morgue to identify the body and fill out paperwork. On her way, she stopped by my grandmother's to break the news. When she came in, my grandmother said, "Oh, it's a sad day. He just died past midnight. I imagine, at least." My grandmother had begun to show some signs of dementia or just basic old age, so the weird comments weren't too out of character, and my aunt assumed that the hospital or one of the siblings had already called to tell her the news. My aunt shook it off and drove to the morgue. When she saw the death certificate, she was shocked to see the time of the death listed as, you got it, 12:10 a.m. On her way home, she stopped back at my grandmother's and asked her who called her to tell the news, and asked why she said that she thought he died just past midnight. My grandmother said, "He came to see me at 12:30, and we talked for a spell. He wanted to apologize for all he's done to me and your kids. I think he made his peace and was able to move on, so I'm glad for that." My grandmother then resumed humming and doing a jigsaw puzzle. I saw my deceased ex-husband in my kitchen. I was watching TV in my living room in the middle of the day and kept hearing the sound like someone was jiggling their change around, and it was loud as if they were in the room with me. I paused my TV, yet the sound persisted. So I start to look around the room, and when I got to the kitchen, I saw him standing there. He was looking around as if taking stock of my apartment. Oh, and he was jiggling change in one hand while flipping a quarter in between his fingers with the other hand, something he did a lot when he was alive. He turned his head and saw me frozen staring at him. The expression on his face was known, I would never forget. His eyes got huge and he kind of tilted his head forward with the expression like, "You can see me?" I don't know how long we stared at each other for, but I turned away when I started to hear my cat ripping up the freaking carpet in the other room. When I turned back, my ex, he was gone. It's worth noting that he had only been dead for a couple months. Some Romanian woman I worked with told me that the dead stick around for 3 months before crossing over. I don't know about all that, but I know without a shadow of a doubt what I saw that day. I used to be in the military, and the training camp bunk that we lived in was said to be haunted. Occasionally, our stuff would go missing and reappear in weird places, like under our bed or inside a bag that we had zipped up and stuff. No big deal, right? I mean, human error and all. Then came the instant that freaked everyone out. It was one night after lights out and my friend was on his phone texting his girlfriend. Most of us were drifting off to sleep and were laying on our beds, etc. Suddenly, he heard the shuffling of feet from the corridor, so thinking it was our sergeant, he quickly hid his phone under his pillow, rolled over on his side, and pretended to sleep. To this day, what happens next chills me to the bone. While he pretends to sleep, he heard someone right behind him, and the other side of his bed going, "Don't worry. You can continue to pretend to sleep." I would dismiss this as a figment of his imagination, except about 5 other people around him heard it as well, including me. Creepier still, there's no one there, and it was a voice of a little girl that said it. For reference, our training camp was in the middle of an island and was set up away from the main admin blocks. The island has been closed by the government for army training purposes for the past 15 years or so. There was no civilians around, let alone kids. To make matters even more freakier, when we came back from our weekend home leave, there was a bunch of female hair on his bed neatly bundled up along and jet black. Under his pillow was a note, "Remember me." That's all it said. Now, as I said, we were in the middle of a forest in the middle of an island, and then there were no female recruits, no personnel on the island. Our bunks were locked up for the weekend, and duty sergeant had no idea the incident happened. We never spoke about it after that night. It still chills me to the bone thinking about it. I was running on the trails at the Nathan Hale Homestead 18th century farmhouse and property of the Revolutionary War hero in Connecticut, which is only about a 10-minute drive from my grandmother's lake house. I could not find a map of the trails anywhere online, and there did not seem to be a signage at the place, just a bunch of random mountain bike trails in the woods. I was only going to run 4 miles, so I estimate that I would run for about 30 minutes using my watch to keep myself on track. So I ran around the trails for a while and nothing seemed to be out of the ordinary. It was about 9 on a Monday morning and the only sounds were the distant hum of Route 31, birds chirping, and the occasional squirrel or deer that scampered off whenever I came near. The trail seems to wind around a lot, and it's not for my better than average directional skills. Humble brag. I could have easily gotten lost. About 20 minutes in, I saw something strange about 50 meters off and a finely polished, light-colored wooden coffin. I was a little weirded out, to say the least, and I waited until I got closer for a better look. I rounded a corner where several old tree stumps blocked my view, only to find the coffin had simply disappeared. Where it should have been was a clump of ferns. Odd. I turned around shortly thereafter and made my way back to my car. I was maybe half a mile out when I heard a very distinctive knocking on a nearby tree to the rhythm of shave and a haircut. Tuck, 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 except no 2 bits. I was a little spooked, but chalked it up to being a woodpecker or something. However, not 30 seconds later, there it was, a completely different tree up ahead. Tuck, 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 tuck. I picked up the pace. The trail widened a little and I could see the way ahead of the entrance at the parking lot where my car was. There it was again, on a tree seemingly right next to me. Tuck, 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 tuck. I truly started freaking out and started to book it back to the lot. I was nearing the opening when time seemed to slow down. All of a sudden, it felt like the temperature dropped about 20 degrees, the birds stopped singing, and my simple Timex watch started to malfunction, making all sorts of beeping noises and the numbers glitching on the screen. The beat sounded impossibly loud, this time like it was hacked into every surrounding trees. Talk, to talk, talk, to talk, talk. An overwhelming sense of dread washed over me, and I anticipated hearing the 2 bits refrain. And perhaps worse. I burst into the parking lot and everything went back to normal. The temperature was back in the mid-70s and the birds were chirping away. I looked at my watch only to discover that it had gone completely blank. I stood there and stared at it until it flashed to 12 Monday 101 January 1st. My watch had reset itself. It's never done this before. I got into the car and started the engine. The clock on the radio display reads noon. That can't be right. It shouldn't have been around 9:30 or 9:45 at the latest. I put her in reverse and backed up to where I could make my way out onto the main road. However, as I went back to throw the car into the drive as I sat there, I heard a sharp rapping sound on the back window, like someone hitting their knuckles, talk to talk, talk, talk. There was no one else in the parking lot when I had just finished my run. No cars, no sign, nothing. I did not dare look back and hightailed it back to my grandmother's house. I have no idea what could have caused this series of events and still not can explain it to this day. I had quite a few scary incidents happen to me, but here's my top 5 scariest. Number 1. I just gotten done working out in my basement and was too lazy to go upstairs and use my normal shower, so I decided to use the one in the basement. As I was shampooing my hair, I heard a little girl singing outside of the bathroom door. Mind you, I was home alone. I turned the water off and called out to see if anyone was down there, and it just stopped. I put the water back on and was rinsing off when it started up again, but this time it just sounded like humming. I ran upstairs with shampoo still in my hair and never used that shower again. Number 2. My brother, my ex-boyfriend, and I was home alone one day. My ex and brother were playing video games in the basement. They came back upstairs while we were all sitting on the couch, talking when we heard a loud bang in the basement. My ex, of course, sent me to go check on it to see what the noise was. When I went downstairs, all the lights were on and there was a box that had been resting securely on a table against the wall, and it was in the middle of the floor. Number 3. The same ex and I were hanging out in the basement one day watching Stand By Me when we heard running behind us. Thinking it was my dog, my ex called her name, but she wasn't down there at all. So we were a little spooked but kept on watching the movie. A few minutes later, I see him look behind me with a terrified expression. I turn around to see a flesh-colored blob dart in the laundry room. We left for the night and never went back to that basement again. Number 4. I was home alone one day while my dad was working and the rest of my family was upstate. I kept hearing running up and down my basement steps and the stairs to my grandma's part of the house. It was so loud that my dog eventually started to bark, and I had to call my friend to come hang out with me. When my dad got home from work, he went into the basement and came back up right away, demanding to know why the picture of Jesus was upside down. I never did it, and when the rest of my family came back home, they all said they did not do it either. My grandma and mom are very religious, so they would never dream of doing something like that. And number 5, my cousins and I went away for the weekend 3 years ago, and we were staying at this little hotel by the water. I slept with one of my cousins in one bed, and my other cousin, her sister, slept in the other bed. In the middle of the night, our last night there, I heard a loud bang as if someone had fallen, followed by a little girl laughing at footsteps. The cousin who I was sharing the bed with screamed bloody murder and shook me to see if I heard it too, which I was pretending I had not, and my other cousin slept through the whole thing. The next morning, she told us she had a weird dream that a little girl was running around the room, pushing our stuff off the table. There I was, bored in the combat zone in Iraq, drawing a picture. It was of the scenery, a few hills, some dead grass, and a tree stump. On the stump, I decided to draw a creature, a humanoid, like a pygmy werewolf, 4 foot something with claws and teeth. The commander shows up and calls us for a mission. I put away my drawing. Weeks later, we're in an abandoned base staying in some new buildings. No windows, no doors, anything. Just the concrete bones, and opening for the installations of these things. Every night we have to set up a watch. It takes the whole platoon to cover the building, minus a few per floor to run the reinforcements. I was one such reinforcement, sitting in an empty room in the dark. After a while, I noticed I'm not alone. I look up and the thing I drew is sitting on the ceiling staring at me. I stared back, gripping my M249, waiting for something to happen. When my team leader comes in, asking if I'm okay, as I tell him yes, he walks over to one of the holes where the window would be, looks out, turns back and asks, "Did you see that?" Later, near the Iran border, we stayed another abandoned base, a bunch of classrooms spread between 6 buildings, all on one floor, with walls that do not reach the ceiling. I had just gotten off a guard shift and came back in my room. My buddy's in there, staring at the ceiling. I look up. There it was again. "What is that?" my buddy asked. Just then, our squad leader comes in asking what we're doing. We explained, but when we looked, it was gone. I never saw it again in that country. Fast forward several years later, I get injured in Iraq from faulty equipment, get a medical discharge, and go on with my life. One day, I'm in a bookstore. I find this book on demons. I flip through it, and there it is. The same thing I drew, the same thing I saw twice at 2 different locations, preceding a personal injury that plagues me this day. The universe. That was 10 very creepy and most unexplained paranormal stories you've ever heard. If you enjoyed today's content, make sure you smash that like button and do subscribe to the channel, as Midnight Monster releases daily videos of the most blood-curdling, creepy, and unexplained stories you've ever heard.